name for us?
Yes, of course. So my name's Rob France. I'm a Chief Superintendent with Thames Valley Police. I'm the current Gold Commander for Op Restore, which is our response to COVID. So that's not a good answer for your recording.
No, that's fine, don't worry.
Across the force. And you spell my name R-O-B, and then the surname is F-R-A-N-C-E.
The first question was, what's it been like on the ground for your officers enforcing the COVID rules?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a challenging situation because it's something that we're having to learn and to adapt to. I think it's new for everybody, but really it's about core policing skills. It's about understanding what's required, about engaging with the public, and making sure that we're keeping our community safe in a way that is supportive of the community's need.
And are you happy with the kind of level of arrests and enforcement that is going on here?
Yes, this is not principally about enforcement. The vast majority of the people of the Thames Valley are complying with the regulations, which are there to keep us all safe. We only move to enforcement in those cases where, people are consciously and deliberately choosing to flout the rules, which are there to keep people safe.
And I think, so some of the statistics that I was sent was, you say 0.03% of the population has kind of received a fine or an arrest. Obviously that's the population of about 2.34 million, so we've got about 800 people there. Do you think you're doing enough?
I'm really confident we're doing enough, because what you're seeing there is the formal record of enforcement, and that's something we're only doing where people are choosing to deliberately flout the rules. Most of the activities officers are engaged in is talking to people, engaging, explaining and encouraging them to follow the rules. And when people understand what's required, what we find is that they follow the rules and keep people safe. But where people are deliberately choosing to flout the rules, that's where we enforce. And that's really important, because the vast majority of the people in the Thames Valley are following the rules. And I think they would expect us to enforce where people are making that deliberate choice to put others at risk.
Is there any particular type of person that is deliberately flouting the rules?
It's not really a type of person, but what we're finding is that most of the breaches that require enforcement are where people have gathered in more than 6 people in breach of that part of the regulation. And in a small number of cases, we're seeing people who breach the quarantine, where people are coming back from countries where they're required to stay at home in order to keep people safe and are simply choosing not to follow that regulation.
Right. Some of the people in the video don't seem that worried that they're getting a fine or that they have police turning up at their house. They almost seem like, well, we kind of knew that was the risk, so be it type thing.
Well, so I think that's a good example of where it's so important that we have enforcement powers and we use them effectively. Where members of our community are doing their very best to follow the rules, and the vast majority of people are doing that, then of course we would encourage them to do that and explain where necessary. But where there's an example like the one that you're giving me, where people are clearly choosing to flout the rules, they know what they're doing, they've chosen to take a risk. That's where enforcement is so important to keep our communities safe, and they'll receive a fine, £120 on the first occasion, and if they continue to flout the rules, that fine would escalate.
I guess the thing that I was getting at is that maybe eventually, there's going to be a bit of COVID boredom, if you like, COVID fatigue, and people will just think, well, you know what, £120 fine, it's a lot, but maybe it's worth it to see my friends.
Okay, so it's really important to understand that the vast majority of people are complying with the rules. So I don't think there is the COVID fatigue that you're talking about out there in the community. What we see is a very small number of people who are deliberately choosing to flout the rules. And when they do that, they're putting other people at risk. The fine level is, I think, a significant deterrent. But of course, if people continue to flout the rules and they get further fines, then we see that cost escalating. I think the highest fine that we issued in the last 6 months or so was £680. And that's, more significant because we're seeing people in those small number of cases consistently breaking the rules.
Thank you. And that video was obviously an example of one type of incident that your teams have been addressing. What other types of incidents are very typical for you?
Yeah, so in the vast majority of cases where we see a breach, and I would want to emphasise they're still very small numbers, it is people breaching the rules in terms of numbers of gatherings, so more than 6 people. And actually that house party example is very typical of where we need to move to enforcement, where people have deliberately chosen to break the rules, they've taken a risk by having a party at their house, and I think the public would expect us to enforce when the vast majority of them are following the rules. We have a small number of breaches that are connected to things like breaches of quarantine, where people have been abroad and come back knowing they need to isolate and have chosen not to do so. But most of the time what officers are doing are engaging, explaining and encouraging people to follow the rules, because the population of the Thames Valley want to be compliant, they want to keep people safe. And where people are doing that, which is the vast majority of people, then we don't need to enforce.
Doing that?
No, I think that's really important. We've got to make sure that our enforcement is proportionate. The vast majority of people in the Thames Valley are complying with the rules, and we have a very low level of enforcement because of that. But where people are deliberately choosing to breach the rules, then it's really important we enforce it, both in order to keep people safe and to give the wider population confidence. So, we have an intelligence-based approach. We know where we're seeing reports of COVID breaches. We know where we're getting information from partners or from the public that they have concerns that people are choosing to breach the rules and putting others at risk as a result, and that's where we target our activity.
So you're actually being helped by other members of the public phoning you up and saying, we're concerned about this or that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think it's not surprising that when the vast majority of people in the Thames Valley are choosing to follow the rules, that when they have a concern, they would want to share that with the police. Now, we give people advice on the phone. We try to understand what the nature of the report they're making is so that we can take a sensible and proportionate response to that. But clearly what we build up is a picture of where we're getting, repeated breaches, or there are strong areas of community concern, or where we're seeing breaches in areas where we know that there's a higher prevalence of COVID, and that's where we'll target our enforcement activity.
Which areas are those?
So I think we go with the tiering system across the country. So across the Thames Valley, we're mainly tier 3, but I think it's no surprise that what we see is in more built-up areas where we have higher numbers of people, then we see higher levels of reporting.
Okay, fair enough. Not high enough anymore.
Yeah, I think so. From where I'm seeing things, the level of compliance in the Thames Valley is really high. Most of the people that are living in the Thames Valley area are following the rules, and they understand that in doing that, they're keeping themselves and their loved ones safe. So I don't detect any degree of COVID fatigue. What we do see is a small number of people who are deliberately choosing to flout the rules, and when that's the case, it's appropriate that we move to enforcement, and we will continue to do so.
Do you think the level of compliance here is greater, say, than in other places in the UK?
I'm really sorry. I don't have any way of judging what the level of compliance might be in other parts of the United Kingdom.
And I guess, you're obviously very happy with what the public's doing. What's your message to them?
Look, I'd want to start by saying thank you. With the vast majority of people complying with the regulations and with the law, that keeps all of us safe and makes our job much easier. Allows us to make sure we can continue to deliver that high level of service across, the other areas where the police need to serve the public. But what I would say is, follow the rules and regulations, keep yourself and others safe. Thank you for doing that. But if you're one of the people who's choosing to deliberately flout the rules, if you're doing that knowing that it's the wrong thing to do, you can expect us to enforce legislation, you can expect to receive a fine, and you can expect us to keep the wider community safe by demonstrating that the right thing to do is to follow the rules.
Okay. Is there anything I've not asked you that you particularly want to highlight?
Only that when you asked me the question about where we might see wider enforcement, I said tier 3, and actually, of course, I've got my tiering back to front. Tier 1 is the medium tier level. I don't know if you want me to give you that answer again with the right tier in it.
Well, no, I was asking about different levels of compliance.
Yes, you asked whether there were particular areas where we need high levels of enforcement, and I said, we use the national tiering model.
Yeah, go ahead. Just start the answer again. Yeah,
okay, so we use the national tiering model to understand where we might have, challenges in terms of compliance. That's not right, actually. I'll do that again, if that's all right. So we use the national tiering level to understand where we have higher prevalence of the virus. And of course, at the moment, although these things can change, Thames Valley Police is in tier 1, which is the medium risk level. And I think that's probably no surprise given the makeup of the Thames Valley at this time.
Okay. It's not having enough of an impact. What would you say to those people?
So I'd say, first of all, if somebody has a concern like that, please do call us, because the first thing that will happen is that the person taking that call will be able to talk through the regulations and the law with the caller to understand whether there has been a breach. And that, we are committed to making sure that where we have those people who are deliberately choosing to flout the rules, that there is firm enforcement. But the vast majority of the people in the Thames Valley are following the regulations. They're doing that to keep themselves, their families and others safe. And that in those circumstances, when officers attend, they will have engaged, explained and encouraged people to follow those regulations. And where people have, responded appropriately to that, have shown that they are trying to follow the rules to the best of their ability, then I think the right thing to do is to allow them to do that. It's where people are ignoring the advice of the officers or are deliberately choosing to flout the rules. That's where enforcement is appropriate. And as I say, the reality is that most of the people in the Thames Valley are doing their very best to follow the rules.
Have you come across any businesses who are kind of, not enforcing, say, the wearing of face masks among staff or anything like that?
So the enforcement of the regulations around businesses is led by our local authorities because they're best placed to do that. We'd obviously work very closely with them, but that's not an area where we've taken any enforcement action at this point in time.
Okay, that's great.